Battle of Vienna. After a multitude of Ottoman invasions, the Ottomans, ruled by Suleiman the Magnificent, had begun their last incursion into Central Europe against Habsburg-ruled Austria. They besieged the city of Vienna and waited for the Viennese to either surrender or starve. But eventually, the Polish armies came to push the Ottoman forces back into the Balkans. Afterwards, the previously Ottoman-ruled land of Hungary had fallen to the Austrians. Then Austria's main rival would no longer be the Ottoman Empire, but now Prussia. Eventually, after the decline of the Habsburgs and the beginnings of the Age of Reason, classical music would have its early origins in Austria. Because of its large population in Central Europe, Austria had become a major European power. Glorious Revolution. During the late 1600s, the Kingdom of England was ruled by an absolutist monarch named King James II, the younger brother of the now deceased King Charles II, who was welcomed back from exile to the throne of England after the puritanical regime of Oliver Cromwell had ended. James was a Catholic king of majority Protestant England. The various English Protestant denominations supported the monarch at first until he started enacting several intolerant pro-Catholic and anti-Protestant laws. The English people were getting very angry at the past several leaders of England abusing their power and were no longer going to accept divine right monarchy as a valid justification of power. Public alarm over another potential civil war that may happen was caused by the Queen giving birth to a baptized Catholic baby. If there was going to be a permanent Catholic dynasty ruling England, there was bound to be another crisis. James's older Protestant daughter, Mary II, and his Dutch nephew, William III of Orange, decided to enact a coup against him. William was invited into England from the Netherlands with an army. He invaded and successfully took control of the Kingdom of England. James fled to France, while both William and Mary became the new King and Queen of England, with a newer, more parliamentary system of government. Since James was Catholic, he had a sizable following in Ireland. James, with the help of the French armies, had tried to start an uprising in Ireland against Mary and William. James was defeated in the Battle of Boyne by the English armies. James had returned back to France in exile. Dutch colonial empire and the VOC, Netherlands. Shortly after the Dutch Republic had been founded, the Spanish had invaded the Netherlands one last time and took over the capital city of Antwerp. The city of Amsterdam had become the new capital of the Dutch Republic, which caused many Dutch Calvinists to flee from Spanish occupation to Amsterdam, where they brought their technical skills with them. In the very beginning of the 1600s, there was a peace treaty made between the Spanish and the Dutch. This peace enabled the Republic to heavily renovate itself within its own borders. More shipping capacity was created and many interconnected waterways were dug up that made travel from city to city easier and more efficient. The Dutch then opened trade networks all across the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, which increased their wealth. To rival the Iberian Union, the Dutch had to create an overseas trading empire. The overseas Dutch trade was controlled by trading companies, which would wage wars to open more trade opportunities and increase profits. The Dutch East India Company controlled most of the Old World trading colonies, while the Dutch West India Company controlled most of the New World trading colonies. Ghana. The East India Company had finally begun to set sail for the Indian subcontinent by traveling around the continent of Africa. The Portuguese had already set up a multitude of trading ports and colonies all over the coastal regions of Africa. One of these coastal regions in West Africa was called the Gold Coast. The East India Company had established a new trading port close to the already existing Portuguese one. The East India Company and Portuguese fought over the Gold Coast, and the declining Portuguese Empire had been pushed out. The East India Company would purchase many African slaves who had been captured prisoners of war from further inland. The land was originally inhabited by the Akan people, who were very wealthy from having so many valuable resources within their lands. Angola. The Portuguese had been ruling over coastal Angola, purchasing slaves, until a native kingdom known as the Ambundu kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba started trying to push the Portuguese out of their lands. The East India Company came and helped them remove the Portuguese colonial rule from Angola. The East India Company ended up taking control of the coastlines for a short time. Cape Colony. Trying to get to the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company arrived in the southernmost tip of the African continent. The East India Company would then establish a settlement called Cape Town as sort of a rest stop for their ships traveling from Europe to India. The East India Company had later imported many farmers from the Netherlands to establish agricultural land all along the coastlines of southern Africa. These Dutch descendant farmers became known as the Boers. The native peoples of southern Africa were the hunter-gatherer Khoisan tribes, and the slightly more advanced and extremely warlike Bantu descendant tribes. Mauritius. On their way towards India, the East India Company had found a pristine paradise island somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. There was no native human population on this island. They named it Mauritius after Prince Maurice of Nassau. A few Dutch colonists started building settlements on the island. They saw the indigenous ebony trees as a tradable commodity to export. The East India Company started importing African slaves to cut down the ebony trees and also work on the new sugar cane and tobacco plantations. An invasive species of monkey called the long-tailed macaque were known for causing mayhem within the colony and disrupted a lot of its productivity. Ceylon. Finally, the East India Company had arrived in the Indian subcontinent. The island of Ceylon was very enticing to the Europeans during the spice trade. The Portuguese had been fighting the native Kandyan kingdom for control over the island. Like many times before, the East India Company would intervene and fight off the Portuguese to establish their own trading colony, which would push the Kandyan kingdom back into the landlocked interior of their own island. There were some Dutch settlers on the island who married into the local populations, and a new mixed race group called the Burgher people emerged. Guyana. The West India Company came to Guyana to set up sugarcane plantations to export to other countries for the stimulation of the Dutch economy. They had imported many slaves from Africa to work on the plantations as free labor. The native peoples who lived there were the Waiwai, Makushi, Patamona, Lokono, Kalina, Wapishana, Paimon, Akawayo, and the Warao tribes. They were known for their slash and burn method when clearing land for agriculture, where they burn down large areas of dense jungle to make way for the foraging of crops. They were also known for their basket weaving and hammock weaving skills. For the Waiwai, people ate monkeys as a sign of pride. Suriname. After a war was fought overseas against the English, who were sabotaging Dutch overseas trade to help the Portuguese, the West India Company had had annexed the English colony of Suriname. There were a few small English settlements which were quickly surrounded by company plantations with many African slaves. The native people of Suriname were the Arawak tribes. Many of the imported African slaves had escaped the plantations and fled into the deep jungles that made up most of the region. These former slaves were called the Maroons. These Maroons would often attack Dutch settlements. Brazil. During the Dutch-Portuguese War, the Dutch had invaded the Portuguese colony of Brazil and occupied a sizable portion of it for a short time. The Dutch had attempted to govern Brazil better than the Portuguese ever had. Brazil already had a large Portuguese descendant population already, so permanent rule wasn't very feasible. New Netherland. The West India Company had established a fur trading colony on the coast of North America. They established a new settlement called New Amsterdam, which was mostly a small hub for Dutch fur traders. The furs in question were mainly from the indigenous beavers that were very common there. The original inhabitants of this land were the Algonquian Lenape tribes, who had a matrilineal society where your lineage and identity primarily came from your mother's family line rather than your father's. The population of these tribes had been drastically reduced by diseases accidentally brought over from the Old World by the Europeans. The few Lenape people left, however, were seen by the West India Company as business partners who they could trade goods with. The company also had a good standing with the Iroquois Confederation. Malacca. The East India Company finally started to venture beyond India, even further into the Orient. The Portuguese were far ahead of them at this time and already controlled part of the Malay Peninsula called Malacca. The East India Company invaded the area and conquered it from the Portuguese. The trading port was surrounded by the Malay Johor Sultanate. Dutch East Indies. After the conquest of Malacca, the East India Company had ventured to the southern islands of Indonesia. Yet again, the Portuguese were already there. The East India Company gradually conquered most of the important Portuguese trading ports and replaced them with their own. Indonesia was the one place where the company sought to take full control of the entire region. They conquered most of the islands of Indonesia to dominate trade and monopolize. The VOC had even paid Japanese samurai to genocide several islands within Indonesia to quash any form of resistance. The native Mataram Sultanate attempted to fight off the company several times and came close to defeating them, but to no avail. Taiwan. The East India Company started moving north towards the East China Sea and encountered an island called Taiwan. They quickly set up trading outposts there before any other Europeans did. The native peoples were Austronesian, related to the Indonesians and Malays from before. For the first time in decades, the Spanish waged war against them in Taiwan, but the East India Company fought them back. Afterwards, they had invited many Chinese settlers to work for them and increase productivity for the colony. There were so many Chinese settlers moving to the island for centuries that the Austronesians were outnumbered in their own land. Japan. The East India Company would finally reach the end of the Orient. Japan was already being influenced by the Portuguese. They had been selling the daimyo firearms, causing the rise of a new shogun to dominate the land. The East India Company arrived in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate. The Dutch and the Portuguese were constantly competing with each other. The Portuguese were desperately trying to convert the Japanese to Catholicism, while the Dutch were simply there to trade goods. The Japanese purchased a plethora of Dutch literature that gave the Japanese a new renaissance of modern European knowledge of science, anatomy, mathematics, art, and other fields. New Holland. A Dutch explorer named Willem Jan Zoon, who was the captain of a ship and crew known as the Doifken, had encountered a new land south of the islands of Indonesia. They were the first Europeans to discover this new land. The Dutch later sailed around and charted the northern and western coastlines of this large, mysterious landmass. They named it New Holland, after an area in the Netherlands. The land was not seen as very profitable for the East India Company, so no trade ports were built. This new continent would later be explored further by the British and renamed to Australia. Fiji, a Dutch explorer working for the VOC named Abel Tasman, had begun to venture east of the islands of Indonesia into the more isolated islands of Melanesia. He was the first European to discover the islands of Fiji while trying to find a great southern continent. The native Fijians were a very communal culture, emphasizing strong family units. New Zealand. Abel Tasman and his crew encountered the islands of New Zealand and were about to land there until some native Maori people saw them and sent out 2 canoes. The canoe men started yelling, but the crew could not understand what they were saying. The canoe men started blowing their horns at them. One of Abel's crew members had a trumpet of his own and started blowing his trumpet at the canoe men. They both were blowing horns and trumpets at each other until it started to get dark and they eventually both stopped. The canoemen paddled back to the shore for the night, while the crewmen were keeping watch just in case as usual. The next morning, a larger canoe with more native people paddled toward the anchored ship. The crew tried to invite them aboard, but they kept their distance and eventually went back to shore. The next day, even more canoes with more people paddled closer to the ship. The crew had sent out a small boat with 6 crew members to make close contact with the natives. One of the Maori boats had paddled right up to the small boat. For some unknown reason, one of the Maori attacked one of the crewmen and he fell overboard and died. Several other crewmen were also attacked and killed. The main ship started shooting cannons towards the natives and the rest of the surviving crewmen shot at the Maori. Eventually, the ship pulled up its anchor and fled back out into the ocean. Tonga. Another Dutch explorer named Willem Schouten was the first European to discover the Polynesian islands of Tonga. He briefly traded with the native Tongans. Tongan women were exceptionally skilled at weaving mats, clothing, and other accessories. Samoa. A Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen was the first European to discover the islands of Samoa. Tattoos were a very vital part of the native Samoan culture. They would tattoo their entire arms with intricate designs. The Western world would later take inspiration from the Samoans. Easter Island. Jacob Roggeveen would also discover the island of Rapa Nui on Easter. Because of this, he named it Easter Island. It seemed to be that the Rapa Nui were in the aftermath of a societal collapse. According to Jacob's accounts, the island had a very small population, but fertile land. The entire island had been deforested decades before. The Dutch crewmen had a skirmish with the natives and were forced to leave the island. The natives had caught several European diseases which killed off even more of their population. Dutch Golden Age. After the VOC had established a vast overseas trading empire, the Netherlands became immensely rich. The Netherlands arguably had the highest standard of living in the entire world during this time. Dutch Golden Age art was the best of its time, achieving new heights in realism and mainly depicting the common folk going about their daily lives. There was more of an egalitarian culture in the Netherlands, which involved the common people influencing the government instead of the other way around. Because of the lucrative oceanic trade, more imported exotic goods such as spices, textiles, decorations, art pieces, and jewelry were more common in the Netherlands. Decline of the Habsburgs. Due to the expulsion of the Moriscos, the Spanish Empire had lost a great amount of its population, which had sent the empire into decline. The empire had gotten into serious debt with the Italian, Dutch, and German governments, causing an economic crisis. Philip IV eventually inherited the throne of Spain as a child. He heavily relied on an advisor named Alvarez to help rule his empire. The Spanish Empire would often aid their other family branch in Germany during the 30 Years' War. Alvarez would work extremely hard to attempt to bring back the success of the empire by making the kingdoms under the Spanish crown work together more efficiently. Eventually, the Dutch would finally win their war against the ruling Spanish government, which became a heavy loss for the empire. As the 30 Years' War raged on, the Spanish would suffer from many defeats, especially from the Swedes and the Dutch. Alvarez, after failing to quell the Catalonian revolts in the empire, was forced to step down from power. France began to outcompete the Spanish Empire and would decimate their armies, making it apparent that Spain was no longer the most powerful empire in the world. Finally, the Iberian Union had broken up. Portugal had become its own separate kingdom again. Philip IV was then succeeded by his 4-year-old inbred son, Charles II. He was almost constantly ill and suffered from various health conditions. Because of the blatant lack of a proper male heir, there had been familial infighting as to who should rightfully rule the empire. The French were seen as a huge threat to the Habsburgs. The Spanish Empire had to combine forces with the Dutch and the various factions within the shell of the Holy Roman Empire to fight the rapidly expanding French kingdom to a standstill. Due to Charles's many health problems, he died young, right at the turn of the century into the 1700s. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had finally gone extinct. Origin of the Volga Germans. During the mid-1700s, Catherine the Great of the Russian Empire, having German ancestry, had invited many Germans to settle in the farther eastern areas of the growing empire. They mainly settled near the Volga River and in the Balkans near the Black Sea, as well as Ukraine, many of whom were Mennonites. Some Volga Germans would even ascend into Romanian and other Balkan royalty, while others would simply isolate themselves from the outside world, living in the middle of nowhere in their small, closely knit communities. Origin of the Amish. During the times of the Protestant Reformation in Switzerland, a sect of Protestant Christianity had formed called Anabaptism. Anabaptists were against the baptism of babies due to them being too young to understand religion. Anabaptists would regularly rebaptize themselves as adults, fully knowing about the teachings of the Bible and God. Anabaptists would eventually separate themselves from mainstream society and go live up in the mountains. They were often referred to as the Uberlanders, although many of them moved to Amsterdam or Alsace, where it was more tolerant. Later on, a prominent Anabaptist leader named Jacob Amann decided to create a more strict version of the religion where Anabaptists were required to wear very plain clothes and grow out their beards. Eventually, the French king Louis XIV had expelled the followers of Amann, called the Amish, from France. The British needed more European settlers to colonize the immediate frontier just more inland from the east coast. The Amish were able to settle in the British North American colony of Pennsylvania. They mainly mainly settled upstate on the frontier and even migrated further west into the French frontier colonies of Ohio and Indiana. They didn't have many conflicts with the Native Americans until during the 7 Years' War, when the Lenape tribe would massacre an Amish settlement under the command of the French, since they were in a British colony. Shortly after they had settled in North America, they had a schism between the Old Order Amish and the Mennonites. The Mennonites were not opposed to blending in somewhat with mainstream society, but the Old Order Amish maintained that strict separatist attitude. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the Old Order Amish saw the rapid advancement of technology as a gateway towards laziness, which then, in their eyes, leads to sin and debauchery. They then rejected the use of most technology and emphasized hard work and community. They also opposed most education for their children, since interacting with non-Amish students would result in them engaging more with the surrounding, less backward society. Enlightenment. After the catastrophic religious wars between the Catholics and Protestants that left Europe in disarray, people later began to question whether it was all worth it. Instead of just blindly trusting the doctrines of religion and superstition to explain the world, thinkers began to use their own rationality and empiricism. Using logic and reason, they were able to ascend from the old, outdated ways of the Abrahamic religions to the newer ways of hard evidence, scientific method, and humanist ethics. Another term for this era was the Age of Reason. After the Europeans, including the Dutch, had been exploring other cultures outside of Europe, such as Africa, India, the Americas, East Asia, and the Pacific, Europeans began to have a better perspective of humanity. They realized that society in Europe could be better than it currently is, and always has been for most of history. Numerous human civilizations had been stunted from societal progress toward human happiness for millennia because of organized religions. Now it was time to create a new moral system built around human happiness rather than to appease a god. This is the origin of human rights. Many philosophers during the 1700s believed in deism. Deism was the belief that since divine intervention can't really exist due to things always being determined to happen from prior events, the one thing that still required the presence of a divine unmoved mover was the beginning of the universe. Deism states that a god or unknown deity had to have created the universe at the beginning of time and has done nothing else except watch history unfold. One of these Enlightenment philosophers was Immanuel Kant, who created the categorical imperative. Frederick the Great and the Rise of Prussia. After the Great Northern War between the Russian Empire and the Swedish Empire, King Frederick II had invaded and conquered the Germanic land of Silesia from the Austrian Empire and humiliated them. This was the beginning of the War of Austrian Succession, which allowed Prussia to rise as a European power. During the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great had put his military strategy skills to work in the conquest of Bohemia and Saxony. Prussia was on the side of the British Empire and against France. Later on, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had gotten significantly weaker and was under threat of being a Russian satellite state. Prussia later annexed large areas of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to stop the Russians from moving any further west. Throughout the next century, the Kingdom of Prussia would become increasingly nationalistic and try to unite the Germanic peoples under one empire. Origin of the Illuminati. A man named Johann Adam Weishaupt corrupt, had spent most of his upcoming years surrounded by Enlightenment ideals and principles from his parents. Johann was from the German land of Bavaria, where he was educated in a Catholic Jesuit school and became disillusioned by the tired old teachings of the Roman Catholic Jesuit order. He tried to get into a canon law school, but the church had heavily influenced it, and clergymen mainly dominated the field. Johann attempted to join the Freemasons, but his beliefs didn't quite align with them. He then started his own secret society called the Illuminati, which was modeled after the Freemasons. The idea of the Illuminati was to influence the people in the upper echelons of Western governments to reform their society, to emphasize rationality, science, and to be rid of religion and superstition. Only young men under 30 were allowed into the Illuminati since they seemed to be more with the times than older people tended to be. The Illuminati had many occult mystical influences. They typically did bloody sacrifices with animals as an initiation ritual to climb up the hierarchy. There were 3 ranks within the Illuminati hierarchy: novice, minerval, and illuminated minerval. Much of the imagery they used for their organization was inspired from the Roman goddess of wisdom, with the addition of Baron Adolf Knigge, a high-ranking recruiter for the Illuminati. The organization became very widespread and grew to have thousands of members from across several other countries, such as Italy, Hungary, and Poland. Even Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, had supported Johann and his endeavors in creating a better, more enlightened society in Europe. With the organization's widespread popularity, it was no longer much of a secret society. Governments grew highly suspicious of the Illuminati. Since there were so many members of the Illuminati now, there were many disagreements between members, and there was internal conflict. Eventually, the Bavarian government under Duke Karl Theodor banned the Illuminati, along with all secret societies within Bavaria. Johann was exposed and fired from his job in law. Johann then fled to Gotha, where he was protected by Duke Ernest, who allowed him to live without having to work at a job. Later, Johann died of old age, and the Illuminati had faded into obscurity. Eventually, the Illuminati became a subject of a countless amount of conspiracy theories due to its liberal nature, occult influences, and general mystique. Beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. In the latter parts of the 1700s, Western culture had shifted away from religious traditions and towards science. Because of this, technology began to advance much faster than ever before. The mercantile companies of old would then evolve into capitalist corporations. Eventually, small rural towns would rapidly grow into large industrial cities with huge factories full of steam-powered machinery and workers toiling away at their jobs. The environment would suffer greatly from human pollution from then on. The life of the ordinary person would drastically change during this time. It mainly started in England, but quickly spread all across the Western world over the course of decades. Batavian Republic. During the latter years of the 1700s, the Dutch Golden Age had waned, and the current stadtholder, William V of Orange-Nassau, became a dictator. The new liberal Dutch Patriot Party had rebelled against the regime. The uprising was crushed, and the patriots went into exile in France. Down in France, the common French people were reaching their wits' end with the corruption and severe wealth inequality from the French monarchy. Eventually, the French started a more successful revolution, which the Dutch patriots were somewhat involved in. The monarchy was overthrown, and the revolutionaries had taken over the country. The French Revolution held many of the same values as the Dutch patriots. The First French Republic had then invaded into the Netherlands by the requests of the patriots. Finally, the corrupt Dutch regime was destroyed and replaced with the Batavian Republic. The name Batavian comes from the ancient Germanic tribe that inhabited the Netherlands called the Batavi, who wanted to achieve freedom and liberty according to their national lore. Helvetian Republic. Just like the Batavian Republic, the Helvetian Republic was the result of French revolutionary armies taking control of the old Swiss Confederation and turning all of Switzerland into a satellite state for the First French Republic. Eventually, the short-lived republic would soon be replaced by Napoleonic rule. Dutch burghers of Ceylon. The British Empire had taken control over the entirety of the island of Sri Lanka and imposed colonial rule. The Dutch burgher people were given some rights and power within the colony. They mainly owned coffee plantations on the coastal regions of the island. The British Empire would industrialize the island and bring the land from a backwards feudal society into a more modern one. Although it still remained very hierarchical, the British people who moved to Sri Lanka held the most power, privilege, and prestige. The prestige language of Sri Lanka became English. The Dutch burghers had to conform to British customs, like speaking English instead of Dutch or Sinhalese. Napoleonic Wars and the end of the Holy Roman Empire. After the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, a highly narcissistic dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in France. Napoleon was a military tactics savant. He won battle after battle throughout Germany and formed several puppet states. He even abolished the now ceremonial entity that used to be the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon's family would marry into Spanish royalty. Various Italian kingdoms would fall under Napoleon's empire. The British, however, were safe since Napoleon wasn't nearly as skilled in naval warfare than land warfare. The British Empire had the best navy in the world. The Austrian Empire would fight with Napoleon over and over again, but lose some of its land each time. Napoleon was unstoppable and a major existential threat to the various European countries throughout the early 1800s. The other European countries, such as the Austrian Empire, Naples, the British Empire, Prussia, and Russia, would team up against Napoleon several times, but were never able to defeat Napoleon's armies. That was until Napoleon tried to conquer Russia, which severely backfired due to the harsh weather conditions. Finally, all of the opposing European countries formed one last coalition and defeated Napoleon's forces, not by winning in battle, but by fleeing and picking off small segments of his armies little by little until they had to retreat. They also burned down many towns so that Napoleon's armies couldn't live off the land, which would make them slower and have to rely on supply lines, which would be severed by the other Europeans. This process was repeated several times until Napoleon was chased back into France and taken down from power. Ludwig von Beethoven. Ludwig von Beethoven was only 1 year younger than Napoleon Bonaparte, but instead of ascending the ranks of the French military and conquering Europe, he would become one of the most iconic classical artists in history. His family was Flemish, but he was born in the German town of Bonn. He was baptized as a Catholic when he was a baby. His father partially trained him to play the piano, but later on there would be other teachers that would help him learn to play the piano, the violin, and the viola. Specifically, his training under Franz Anton Ries was extremely harsh and strict. At a young age, his parents and teachers realized that he was a child prodigy. Christian Gottlob Niefe became his new teacher and taught him how to compose his own music. While Beethoven was an upcoming youth composer, he may have met Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart during the 1790s. His mother passed away and his father became an alcoholic. His father was then fired from his job. Eventually, Ludwig's father had also died. He later saw himself as a successor to Mozart and took a lot of inspiration from him after his passing. He eventually moved from Bonn to Vienna, where he would start performing concerts in front of large audiences. Eventually, Ludwig had developed a type of tinnitus called otosclerosis that gradually worsened with age. Although his hearing would gradually worsen, he would be able to still compose music for several years in the early 1800s. Ludwig became known for having a very distinct sound in his musical style, one of a more emotionally powerful sound. Ludwig originally supported Napoleon at first and wrote some pieces about his quest to spread revolutionary ideas across Europe. This was until Napoleon had crowned himself Emperor of France. Ludwig no longer believed in Napoleon being a savior, but just another power-hungry dictator. Ludwig fell in love with a woman named Antoine Brentano in the Czech town of Teplitz and wrote love letters to her, but she never had much interest in him. Another woman named Guicciardi had caught Ludwig's attention later on. The two would flirt with each other and Ludwig would consider her his soulmate, but eventually, because of her controlling father, she would have to marry an elderly, wealthy count named Joseph Dame. Antoine Brentano, a married woman, later had an affair with Ludwig. Although she and her husband both left Vienna and all contact between her and Ludwig had been severed, Ludwig was a hopeless romantic. After 1812, Ludwig would never love again. During the 1810s, his hearing loss would become much more severe. He would also be involved in a custody battle with his dead brother's widow over their son, but he would eventually lose. Even during all of this, Ludwig's music was more popular than ever before. This productivity wouldn't last, however. Ludwig would have long drawn-out health issues and was ill for extended periods of time, leading to less frequent musical performances. Eventually, despite the mother of his nephew winning the custody battle, the boy had moved in with Ludwig but would frequently be fought over between the two. By this time, Ludwig's hearing loss had gotten much worse. He eventually got through his sickness and got back into a resurgence making music. He alone started the Romantic era of orchestral music. He eventually grew old and deaf. He had several health complications that then led to his death. His nephew started to consider him a father and stayed at his deathbed. Decline of the Dutch colonial empire, Netherlands. As the Enlightenment had reached its most prominent point and the Industrial Revolution had been on the rise, the Dutch Golden Age was gradually fading away, and the Dutch colonial trading empire began to decline. The British began to take their place as the dominant seafaring empire. Ghana. Eventually, the British had established their own forts along the Gold Coast region of West Africa. The British would often wage battles against the native-ruled Ashanti Empire and fend off several other European forces, including the Dutch from the area. Cape Colony. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Empire had annexed the Dutch Cape Colony, which at the time was controlled by the Batavian Republic. The British were attempting to remove several of the major Dutch colonies in case Napoleon were to take control of them. Shortly after, settlers from England began to migrate to the Cape Colony and started displacing the local Boer population. Mauritius. The Dutch had eventually left the island of Mauritius as they no longer saw the island as profitable. The French eventually started to set up shop there and renamed it to Isle de France, Ceylon. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British feared that the Dutch colony of Ceylon in Sri Lanka would be handed over to Napoleon by the Batavian Republic. The British then annexed the coastal areas of the island where the VOC controlled. The Dutch burgher people who chose to stay on the island had integrated somewhat into British colonial society, where many had converted to Anglicanism. Guyana. The British Empire eventually invaded the Dutch colony of Guyana during the Napoleonic Wars for the same reasons as Sri Lanka and South Africa. Suriname. Again, the British had annexed Suriname from the Batavian Republic during the Napoleonic era to stop a potential French takeover. New York. During the Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch had invaded the short-lived English colony of Suriname. As part of a post-war agreement between the Dutch and the English, the colony of New Netherland had gotten absorbed into the surrounding English mid-Atlantic colonies. New Amsterdam was renamed to New York. They also now controlled New Jersey and Delaware. There weren't very many Dutch settlers there in the first place, so they were heavily anglicized. Malacca. The British Empire then slowly encroached on Malaysia and took control of the Dutch colony of Malacca in a treaty. Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company had held out against the British Empire for so long that they eventually had to dissolve the company due to bankruptcy. The colony was then taken over by the Dutch government directly as the Dutch East Indies. Taiwan. The last ethnic Han Chinese dynasty, called the Ming Dynasty, had fallen. A new dynasty arose which hailed from Manchuria, called the Qing Dynasty. A formerly Ming general named Zheng Chenggong, Prince of Yanping, had pledged his loyalty to the last Ming emperor, Zhu Yulang, and attacked the Qing-ruled areas. He eventually fled to the island of Taiwan with his armies and took over control of the island from the Dutch. Japan. In Japan, all of the daimyo kingdoms were being ruthlessly conquered by one kingdom called the Tokugawa shogunate, as they were forcefully unifying the islands of Japan under one shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The shogunate had attempted to invade the close-by land of Korea, but failed. The Tokugawa shogunate had then closed off Japan from the outside world and became isolationist. The Dutch port that was there was the only exception to this new isolationist policy. The Dutch still continued to sell the locals European literature and other goods from around the world. Belgian Revolution. While most of the Netherlands had become an independent nation from Spain and had forged an overseas colonial trading empire around the world, the southernmost regions of the Netherlands were still ruled by the Habsburgs in Spain and later on in Austria. This political divide had separated the region for so long that they became two different cultures. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Netherlands in its entirety had become one unified kingdom. During the authoritarian rule of the Dutch under King Willem I, the Flemish and French-speaking people of the southern Netherlands were very underrepresented in the parliament. In the city of Brussels, peasants started riots, which then escalated into a full-scale revolution, with the introduction of Belgian nobility. The revolution quickly spread throughout the rest of Belgium. The Belgian rebels overthrew the Dutch rule in their lands and established a new popular monarchy. The monarch in question was named Leopold I. Later on, the Dutch had made one last-ditch effort to reconquer Belgium in the 10-day campaign, but it would ultimately fail. Communist Manifesto. During the mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution and capitalism had reached a point no longer desired for human life. Most people were forced to work long hours in soul-crushing factory jobs while getting very little money in return, often not enough to make ends meet for themselves or their impoverished families. This This caused Karl Marx, a highly educated man who had delved into philosophy and politics. He saw the rampant corruption done to his country by capitalist corporations, and he wanted to figure out a feasible alternative for this. He and his friend Friedrich Engels had written a detailed critique of capitalism called the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was used as a pamphlet for the early emerging German Communist Party. Marx wrote that history has had 4 different stages, the first being primitive communism, where there were only tribes who lived communally and equally before the emergence of human civilization and technology. The second stage was slavery, where the vast majority of people were at the total brutal mercy of kingdoms and empires, which would often use force upon their own populations for slave labor. This is usually during the times of ancient kingdoms and empires, such as the ancient Egyptians, ancient Greeks, Romans, the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians, etc. These ancient civilizations had the most oppressive and brutal hierarchies, where the concept of human rights was virtually non-existent. The third stage was feudalism, where kings, noble lords, and organized religions ruled over the lower peasant majority of the population. The church had the power to wage holy wars and burn people at the stake who spoke against the religion, but at least the major religions had some sense of morality that could guide people into the right direction. Eventually, the current stage of history at the time of Karl Marx was capitalism, where monarchs and the church no longer held as much power over the people. But now, the evolution of mercantilism has gotten so advanced that these small companies meant to sell items in exchange for money are now giant corporations that can control and take advantage of entire countries for profit. Marx then writes that the future holds 2 more of these stages. The very next stage being socialism, where the oppressed workers rise up in an armed uprising against the corrupt government, destroy the capitalist corporations with this new executive power, and seize the means of production. Afterwards, there would be a gradual transition from socialism into full communism. This final stage of humanity would be in the far future, where all hierarchies would be non-existent and people could live communally again, just like during tribal times. Except there would still be technology and infrastructure. Everyone would have the learned moral duty to do their part in upholding communist principles. The 1848 revolutions. As the Industrial Revolution had been vastly changing the working class way of life, people's jobs in factories had become more automated, which made many workers lose their jobs and fall into poverty. At the same time, people had been yearning for the unification of their ethnic regions. Most notably, the Germans and the Italians had been wanting to shake off all foreign domination of their lands, unify their countries, and form their societies to have more equal opportunities for the common people. This would later spark the Hungarian rebellions within the Austrian Empire. The revolutions in Germany, however, were unsuccessful due to the disunity between the different revolutionary factions. The Great Trek. Shortly after the British Empire had taken control of the Cape Colony, the British had begun to impose their laws and British culture and customs upon the Boers. The British had also outlawed slavery, which the slightly technologically backwards Boers depended on. The Boers decided to move away from British rule further inland towards the untamed plains and deserts of the north. These Boers were called the Voortrekkers. The Xhosa tribe had helped the Voortrekkers move into a further north land as a buffer between them and the extremely hostile and warlike Zulu Empire. The Zulus had been killing large populations of their neighboring lands during the Mfecane. Many non-Zulu native tribes had been evacuated out of their territories, which allowed easier access for the Voortrekkers. A failed diplomatic attempt had occurred between a band of Voortrekkers and the Zulu king Dingane, which caused several brutal massacres of Voortrekker camps, including the slaughter of women and children. The Voortrekkers had then retaliated against the Zulus, but had been defeated in battle and had to fall back towards their own camps, where another large battle took place. This is where the Voortrekkers, even though they were vastly outnumbered by the Zulus, were able to hide behind their wagons in a circle formation, which greatly helped them in battle. Eventually, they had killed off enough Zulu warriors that they were starting to retreat. This was the Battle of Blood River. Afterwards, the Voortrekkers were able to settle into the lands they were supposed to get to. German immigration to Mexico. After the failed 1848 revolutions back in Europe, many German people had mass migrated to Mexico during the reign of the Second Mexican Empire. They would commonly mix into the local mestizo populations and introduced several aspects of German culture into Mexico, such as music, beer culture, and clothing. German immigration to the Empire of Brazil. At the same time as the Germanic diaspora into Mexico, and for the same reasons, Germans had also been mass migrating mainly into Brazil. The Germans who immigrated to Brazil had mainly settled in the southern, more subtropical areas and had contributed to the pioneering of the outer areas of the Amazon jungles. They would have to clear out virgin forests to make way for more settlements, but would commonly get attacked by the native Amazonian tribes. Boer republics. As the Boers had recently settled into their new lands, they established new states there. These states were called the Boer republics. There were Stellaland, Goshen, the South African Republic, the Orange Free State, the Natalia Republic, and Klein Vrystaat. Stellaland was fought over between the expansionist South African Republic and the British Empire. Goshen, during its short life, had united with Stellaland at one point, becoming the United States of Stellaland. This republic was also fought over between the British Empire and the Republic of South Africa. The South African Republic of Transvaal was an enemy of the encroaching British Empire and went on to fight the empire over the other Boer republics. The Orange Free State was one of the more prosperous Boer states, but it was frequently raided by the Sotho people. Natalia was one of the early Boer republics founded right after the Battle of Blood River against the Zulus. Klein Vrystaat was a miniature version of the Transvaal Republic of South Africa, partially ruled by the native kingdom of Swaziland as part of an agreement between the Boers and the Swazi king Mbenzeni. La Reforma. During the late reign of the dictator of Mexico, Antonio López de Santa Anna, the Mexican liberals who wanted to remove him from his absolute power and separate the Catholic Church from the Mexican state in the 1850s. The liberals, who were a giant portion of the population, revolted against the regime and were led by the governor of Oaxaca, Benito Juárez. They were able to overthrow the dictator and establish a short-lived liberal government. Leftists controlled most of the government during La Reforma. They tried to have the Mexican Catholic Church be forced to sell away all of their farmlands so that ecclesiastical institutions would have much less power. The church refused and threatened excommunication of many public servants. Within the new government, there was much political dissent causing disorder. Eventually, the conservatives rebelled and formed a new government in other parts of the country. The Reform War lasted several years until the conservative forces lost and fled into exile in Europe. American Civil War. In the young empire of the United States, the northern states had become much more industrialized while the southern states remained an agrarian society. The southern states were highly dependent on the use of slave slave labor for their plantations. The people of the northern states began to realize just how morally wrong slavery was. After several decades of political tension between the North and the South, the country had erupted into civil war. The German Americans of the recently settled Midwestern states had fought alongside the Anglo-American Northerners against the Confederacy. Missouri, however, had a large German population and was part of the Confederate States, fighting against the American Union. The war waged on for several years until the industrialized, more heavily populated, and technologically advanced American Union had defeated the Confederacy. Afterwards, slavery was abolished in the country. Beginning of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The long-lasting Austrian Empire had been ruling over all of Hungary for hundreds of years. The Hungarians had participated in the 1848 revolutions and tried to overthrow Austrian rule from their lands. The Hungarian revolts were stamped out by both the Austrian and Russian armies. A few years later, the northern Italians had rebelled against the Austrian Empire. With the help of the French, the Austrians had lost the territory of Lombardy. After losing Lombardy, the empire went into a decline. The Austrian Empire and Prussia had gone to war for who would become the great Germanic power of Europe. Prussia had won this war and gained more land in the Austrian-ruled Germanic regions of Europe. Prussia then formed the North German Confederation. Fearing that the Austrian Empire would violently collapse, the Hungarians were given a quasi-independent constitutional monarchy similar to the Austrian constitutional monarchy. The two kingdoms were very closely intertwined politically. This was the beginning of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. German settlement of the American frontier. Starting during the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, many Germanic peoples from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands had been mass migrating to the newly formed United States of America. These German immigrants mainly settled on the frontier near the Great Lakes in Ohio, the lower peninsula of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, most parts of Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, Iowa, and northern Missouri. They came into contact with the sparse populations of Native American tribes, who in the previous century had been massacred several times by the Iroquois Confederation. There were also very small populations of Scots-Irish settlements and Amish settlements sprinkled across the extreme seasonal forests of the Great Lakes region. Many of these German settlers were Lutherans. In the 1860s, free land was given to German and some Nordic immigrant settlers as long as they could sustain themselves for at least 5 years while cultivating crops on the land. Many of the settlers had to build their houses out of raised up earth, since the trees in the areas of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma were near non-existent. The native Amerindian people there were nomadic hunters of bison. There were several tribes which roamed these vast open expanses of grass fields called the Dakota, Pawnee, Lakota, Wichita, Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, Apache, Cheyenne, Arikara, Crow, and the Assiniboine. For centuries, these tribes traded furs and pelts with Europeans in exchange for firearms and horses. The European settlers, while migrating into the territories of these warlike tribes, resulted in violent clashes between the two peoples. The U.S. government often intervened and battled against the hostile indigenous tribes and brutally massacred them. The Rocky Mountains region also became home to many German and Nordic immigrant settlers during the Colorado and Idaho gold rushes of the 1860s. One of the main indigenous Amerindian tribes that lived on this rugged mountainous region was the Ute tribe. They spoke a language that was part of the Numic dialect of the Uto-Aztecan language group. The Utes believed that all things in the material world possessed a certain spiritual quality. They believed that spiritual power can be drawn from dreams. Utes often lived with their extended families in a very communal lifestyle. Many of the tribes of the Rockies, besides the Utes, were forcibly moved into reservations to make way for a white settlement of their ancestral homelands. French invasion of Mexico. In the 1860s, the exiled conservative Mexican government had allied themselves with the Second French Empire ruled by Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III. Napoleon used this alliance to his advantage. Now the French had an excuse to invade a developing nation and turn it right back into a European-ruled colony. The French Empire had invaded and conquered most of Mexico, with the excuse of it being an intervention to force the liberal Mexican government to pay off their unpaid debts to the Spanish and French empires. An Austrian Habsburg named Maximilian was going to be a puppet of the Second French Empire to rule Mexico. Benito Juarez and the rest of the liberal Mexicans were in hiding somewhere within the unconquered regions of the country. They then allied with the United States, now that the American Civil War was over. With the monetary aid of the United States, the liberal Mexican government had bested the French armies. Eventually, they had thwarted the French forces and re-established control of the capital. They had even captured Maximilian and finally shot his ass. Otto von Bismarck and the beginning of the Second Reich. The Second French Empire had attempted to restore French control over Central Europe after it had been lost by Napoleon. The Kingdom of Prussia had defeated the invading French forces in the Franco-Prussian War. This effectively made Prussia the dominant power of Central Europe. The Chancellor of the Kingdom of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, had successfully unified the North German Confederation into becoming the official German Empire in 1871. Shortly after, a new emperor named Wilhelm II had been appointed to the throne of the Great Second Reich of Germany. The Kaiserreich was politically conservative-leaning and had developed its military to rival that of the British Empire's armies. The German-speaking people were still far from being completely unified, as the other states, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Switzerland, were still separated from the German Empire. Now, the next course of action was to forge a great colonial empire around the world.